Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Gabby from She Makes It Work, and today we are decoding corporate lingo with a leader. I've got 25 years of leadership experience in the corporate space. I had to learn all of this the hard way, and I am here to help you all understand and learn what all of these phrases mean. So, we're going to go through a set of the normal kind of jargon and buzzwords that you hear in the corporate world. And then we're going to pivot and talk about some specific leader phrases that you might hear as well, because leaders sometimes have their own language too. All right, so let's get started. What I'm going to do is I'm going to list out, or I'm going to start talking about a specific piece of jargon or lingo, and then I'm going to explain it and then move on to the next one. If at any point you have questions, just drop them into chat. And if you have more that you want me to add, just say it as we go. You can put them into chat and I'll pause when it makes sense and put those in, because it may not be on my list, or it may be the one you care about and it's further down on my list. So feel free to just add chats and talk to me. Just 1 second, I'm changing the chat settings, I think. Okay. All right, so let's get started. The first one we're going to talk about is circle back. You probably hear this one all the time. And circling back means you're going to revisit a topic or a discussion at a later time. And this is often used when you're in meetings and someone brings something that's either too deep for the meeting time, or it's maybe slightly off topic. And that happens quite a bit. And the moderator or facilitator of the meeting is doing their job by keeping everybody on track. Or it may be a situation where you are not in a full meeting, but in a one-on-one with your boss, and they're still like, hey, let's circle back on that. Now, unfortunately, circle back has a little bit of a bad rap because people often use it and then they don't circle back. Usually they mean later is never when it comes to talking about the item. So just keep that in mind, that if someone says that you're going to circle back on something, often you'll never hear about that thing again. That's just one of those things that people say. So just keep that in mind. And if anybody ever says, let's circle back on that, just drop it. That's the best thing to do. Don't say when or argue or, ask too many questions. Like, unless it's your meeting and you're running it, that's a whole different ballgame. But more often than not, that's not the situation. And so just kind of respect the facilitator, let it go. But if it's super important to you, bring it up privately afterwards offline. All right. The other key phrase that you'll hear all the time is low hanging fruit. And people mean low hanging fruit as tasks or opportunities that are easy to achieve. So, low hanging fruit is just like you picture a tree and there's a piece of fruit on it, and it's easy to reach and grasp and you can do it. It's the same thing with tasks. So, low hanging fruit, just an example of something at home, might be taking your coffee cup from your bedroom to the kitchen when you're walking into the kitchen. That is low hanging fruit on your list of things to do. At work, it might be something as simple as putting in your time or answering an email really quick. But if anybody says, hey, that's low hanging fruit, their expectation is that it's something that you can take care of quickly. So it either is or it isn't. And if you feel like that is something that is maybe more time intensive than they think it is, that's a good thing to bring up. Definitely mention, okay, I hear you that it's low hanging fruit. My concern was that I thought it might take about 5 hours. Is that what you're thinking too? And just clarify, because I think that's where people get disconnected on low hanging fruit, is maybe disagreeing about how low that fruit is. All right. The next one is bandwidth, which is someone's capacity to take on work or tasks. And even capacity, I think, can be a little bit off putting and vague for some people. So, capacity refers to how much time or how much mental cycles you might have. And I love these words because they are previously technical words that kind of reached into the corporate and business lingo. And so I've enjoyed that as a former geek. But I know that that is sometimes just nonsensical to people of all age ranges, by the way. I've met a lot of older career folks who also are like, capacity, bandwidth, what? Because, bandwidth's a networking term anyway. So it just means how much room you have. And it could be room in your schedule, or sometimes, like I said, it could be mental and emotional cycles. Like, you may have the time, but you may be mentally overwhelmed and don't have capacity for that thing. That's okay. So capacity is a great language to use when you're discussing your own work. I highly recommend that people who aren't familiar with this term actually adopt it, not just to understand it, because it's a great common language for you to use that depersonalizes your ability to talk about being overwhelmed or not being able to take on more work, just by being able to say, I don't have capacity to take on additional work right now. So that's a good one. Or I guess it's bandwidth, but same thing. Bandwidth and capacity are the same thing. All right, so take it offline. It's the same thing as circle back, basically, which is discuss something privately or outside of the current meeting. It is the same thing as circle back, but a lot of times it is meant to be more private. So you might be in a room of 10 people, and if someone says, let's take that offline, they may be indicating that that is a one-on-one conversation or a smaller group conversation. And that can happen a lot if it's something where the topic, whether you know it or not, is sensitive, confidential, or specific, really personal, like about someone or something. And you may not know it, and it's not a bad thing if you accidentally step in one of those situations and someone says, let's take it offline. Like the first few times you hear it, once you do know what it means, it can be like, oh, but you're not getting your wrist slapped. They're just letting you know we're going to move on from that. And taking it offline, unlike circling back, usually you do have a follow-up conversation about whatever the thing is. Sometimes that follow-up conversation is just to understand why it wasn't appropriate for the meeting, just so that you can understand that. So that's a really handy one to use. And as you get to the point where you're facilitating more and more meetings, you'll find that you need these phrases to keep the meeting on track, keep people focused on the right things, and to keep people from talking about things that they shouldn't talk about in certain meetings. So they're very, very handy phrases to have and use yourself. The next one is boil the ocean. I love this one. I learned it once I moved into more consulting and project world, and boil the ocean means attempting an impossible or overly complex task, which is an interesting definition. I'm reading a definition that I had looked up, and I don't know that I completely agree with it. I don't know that I agree that it's impossible. It would be impossible to do all at once. And so what you're doing is you're taking this bigger, more complex problem, and instead of boiling the ocean, you're deciding which piece of it you can tackle as a group. And so a lot of times this will come up in meetings when people are kitchen sinking the conversation. They're just bringing in all this other stuff, and everybody's like, hey, we're not trying to boil the ocean here. We're just trying to solve how to wash this fork, and I don't need you to bring in the whole silverware drawer, right? I don't know if it's a good analogy or not, but that's actually what happens though, is that someone's trying to talk about a specific issue, task, or problem, and people just start like, piling on, frankly, and then you're like, oh, we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're just really trying to talk about this one specific thing. And that's if someone's bringing stuff up in meetings. The other context is, like I said, a project context, where when you're talking about the project scope, for example, or if you're looking at a piece of the project and it's starting to feel overwhelmingly large, that's where you might say, hey, we're not trying to boil the ocean here. We're just trying to get a new, screen out the door for our website. We're not trying to redesign the whole website. And that would be a good example of boiling the ocean. Boiling the ocean is redesigning the whole website in a month versus trying to get 2 new screens out the door, right? And you can see that one would be not so feasible. But it doesn't mean you can't ever do a website design. You're just not doing it in a month, and you have to chip away at it piece by piece. Okay. All right, the next one is synergy, and I'm so glad people don't say this one as much anymore, because it was a huge consulting buzzword for a long time, and it kind of drove me crazy. But synergy is the combined effect that is greater than the sum of individual parts. So I, like many people, find this one super cheesy, so whenever anybody says it, I try to invisibly roll my eyes and not do it visibly, but unfortunately I'm sure that there are times where it is visible, because this one is a little bit cheesy, but the idea of it is actually fine. There is a certain magic to people working together, and it's one of those things where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, but when it comes to work, it really just means that magic that people bring when they come together, and what they're accomplishing is better than what they could individually add it up. I don't know. But most people use it as like a motivational term, or, to be a little bit rah-rah. Anyway, I don't really like it anymore. Like I said, I kind of consider it cheesy. I think a different variation on it is teamwork makes the dream work. And I think that one's more actionable, because it reminds people of what they're supposed to do, which is to work as a team. Synergy, to me, part of the reason it's cheesy is that it sounds a little mystical in a business context, and it's not actionable. How do you synergy? So that's why for me it's just a little, I don't like it. All right, touch base is just to make contact or to follow up with someone. So someone might say, hey, let's touch base on that later. And this is one where they might mean it, Unlike circling back, where I promise you nobody wants to circle back, touch base, usually people do mean that they do want to connect on something. So someone might say, hey, Bob, let's touch base on your question after this, or let's touch base on the status of the yada yada. That's a connection that they actually do want to have. And usually if somebody says, let's touch base on that, that's an invitation for you to set up a follow-up meeting or schedule a quick one-on-one, like a 15-minute one, or to include it if you have a regular scheduled one-on-one. So that's kind of the expected action when someone says, let's touch base on that, is for you to set up time with them. And you can even clarify it easily. Just be like, hey, did you want me to set up time for that? And they'll tell you yes or no. So that's where the norms are sometimes unclear, especially if you're working in a company that's new to you. You don't always know their norms, and there's always rituals about who's supposed to schedule what meetings. I know this seems silly, but there are. And sometimes people know them subconsciously and couldn't even say it consciously. So it's really important if somebody's indicating a follow-up like that to make sure that you're clarifying what the expectation is, because you'll hear about something like that 6 months later. So and so never followed up with me. And you're like, I didn't know I was supposed to do that. You get the point. All right, move the needle. Move the needle. Let's move the needle on this. It's to make progress or have significant impact on something. So if we're saying we need to move the needle on something, it means we need to move it along. And that might be, I'm going to use a development example. You might be working on those screens for the website, and they're saying that we need to either move the needle on customer retention on the website, or they might even say we need to move the needle on progress on developing these screens, right? So move the needle can be used a couple different ways, but it does mean to make impact or to make progress. And so if it's unclear what they want you to move the needle on, one of my favorite questions, and you'll hear me say this all the time, is just, oh, awesome, what does that look like? What does that look like to you? What are you expecting to see? And so that way you're clarifying what is the needling that they are looking to happen. And it's a way that you don't sound like foolish or ignorant or anything like that. Just getting them to clarify what their vision of that is a really good way to get people to open up a little bit without judging you. All right. The next one is run it up the flagpole, which is to socialize or test an idea or a thought to gain reactions. And this one I do like because it's so visual and it's so actiony, unlike synergy, but it's imagining like, hey, let's take that and run it up the flagpole. That could mean, you've got a good idea, you've pitched it to your boss, and they're like, hey, let's go run it by Bob over in accounting and see how he reacts. Let's run it up the flagpole. Or it could mean literally elevating it. Sometimes it means that literally elevating it vertically to some next level up leader to test their reaction to it. It could mean just socializing it in a meeting. So whenever anybody says, let's run it up the flagpole, just be like, awesome, who'd be included in that? Easy. That way, again, you're not making assumptions, and it's an easy thing for them to answer as well. All right, the next one, this one is a little bit out of favor now, and you'll understand why when I say it, but we do still use it a lot. I'm guilty of this one, which is open the kimono. There's two issues with saying open the kimono. One is some cultural, appropriation issues, and the other one is that is literally opening clothing that's not super appropriate for work, but for whatever reason we still use it. A lot of people catch themselves and try not to. But opening the kimono really references just being transparent in a way that you're revealing a secret. You're revealing something. So a little bit of a colorful way to put it. But a lot of times it is intended to mean specifically revealing confidential information. So again, something that was secret, but not just like, Bob's getting married, but, again, something confidential like, hey, we just need to be transparent about this, which is the preferred way to say it. Our budget's only $50,000, right? We're going to open the kimono here and tell you that we have limited funds for this. Or someone might open the kimono and say, hey, you're seeing a lot of leadership drama right now, and it's because so-and-so is retiring, right? So the confidential information could be a couple different kinds of things. But I will say, if you ever hear anybody say this, you should lean in and listen, because whatever it is, it's usually pretty good. And don't say it yourself, because like I said, it's really not a good thing to say. I prefer something about transparency instead of something about a kimono. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. All right, ping. Yeah, I've noticed a lot of people get confused about ping. Ping is to contact someone, usually through messaging or email. So, can you ping Jack? Can you ping Barbara over in accounting? It means can you contact them? And it usually means contact them in an immediate way. So, yes, email is acceptable, but if someone says, can you ping so and so, what they want is for you to reach out to them directly over Slack, Teams, whatever messaging platform you guys are using. Sometimes it's even text them like, hey, so and so is late to this meeting. Can you ping them? And you might say, oh, they're not on Slack. You need to text them. So there's a little, often some sort of implied urgency there. And it depends on the context. Again, if they're late to a meeting, get on that. If somebody asks you to ping somebody, that means get aggressive about it. It doesn't mean send an email and wait 5 days. But depending on the context, it could. Some people do use it slightly more casually. And I do think that this goes back to the days where we actually had sounds on for messaging. And so you'd get like an AOL or a Yahoo instant message and would go like ping, and so this is a holdover from kind of the OG days of that. So that's part of why I'm fond of this one, but we've been using it for so long, right? Like we've been using it in the corporate vernacular for a couple decades now, and so I thought it was really funny when I did notice in the workplace, probably about 5 years ago, I started getting people asking me, what does ping mean? And I'm like, oh, that's so sad when you've worked long enough that you start to see that some things are now fading out of use when you were there when they were starting out. So that was an aha moment for me about my own age. All right. The next one is circle. I'm checking my notes here. The next one is circle the wagons. Circling the wagons is to prepare for defense or build solidarity within a group. That's a really funny way to put it. Circle the wagons, a lot of times it is a little more casual than like building a defense. It just means you're huddling up on something with your group or your team. It does imply that there's a group of people who have some sort of closeness. It's a dedicated team. It's a set of people who enjoy each other. It might be a specific leadership team. It might be a group of people or a level. It might be all of your managers' direct reports. But there's usually some context around who the wagons are in this situation. And a lot of times they're collaborating on a solution to something, and it doesn't always mean preparing for defense, but it does mean that you guys want to be united about something. Whenever you're circling the wagons, it means you're trying to be collaborative to come up with these ideas. Sorry, my cat is hollering. I don't know if you guys can hear her. Morgan, honey. But sometimes it does mean like that you need to close ranks a little bit. But more often than not, when I hear circling the wagons these days, it just means that you guys are gonna get together and brainstorm something and come to a decision as a team. So it's not a bad thing, I can tell you that. But it is, again, a signal to pay attention because something's up. I'll tell you that. All right. So the next one is blue sky thinking. Oh, this is so pretty. I guess we can tell that I like the visual ones, right? Blue sky thinking. Creative, big picture thinking without constraints. And if you think about just a big open blue sky where you don't have like mountains blocking the horizon, it's totally open. And it means that, again, you can be creative without constraints, like don't hold back, big picture, big ideas. Those are some of the things they're trying to convey. And I do have to say I get a little worried whenever I hear somebody talk about blue sky thinking, because usually it means that there's a problem you're not aware of that they're trying to solve through innovation. But so just pay attention if you hear somebody say that, because like I said, that usually means something's up. All right, so again, we are talking about decoding corporate lingo, and we're going through a list of common corporate terminology, and then we're going to go through a list of leader terminology and see what we can see with that. Hold on just a second. All right, so let's move on to the next one, which is let's table that. And tabling that means let's set aside a topic or idea for discussion later. That's the same thing as parking lot. So you'll hear let's table that or let's parking lot that, and those mean the same thing. And if you're in a big meeting, usually they'll say parking lot and they'll have like a big piece of paper or a virtual whiteboard up and they write down the parking lot items. And 9 times out of 10, let's table that or let's parking lot that means it is genuinely irrelevant to the conversation. And I'm telling you that, but what I don't want is for you to then defend in the meeting why you think it's relevant. Because again, whoever's the facilitator, we need to respect the facilitator. It's their job to keep the meeting moving. And a lot of times, if they're saying let's table that or let's parking lot it, it is either irrelevant or it's something that they don't want discussed broadly for some reason. And that goes back to it might start to surface confidential information or information they're not ready to discuss in that group setting yet. But they're not saying take it offline because it's not your business either. And it's not something that they want to signal is anybody's business. So there's subtle nuances to some of the things, some of these things which I don't necessarily expect you to remember, but the more you see them, the more you can come back to this and be like, oh, they said this instead of that. Usually does mean something, like if they use it. Like parking lot is usually if you're in a brainstorming session or a solutioning session and the things on the parking lot may or may not be brought back in later, but let's table that, usually no. And like I said, it's either highly irrelevant or it's very relevant in a way that they don't want people to know yet and they're trying to move the conversation along. And I say respect that more than 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, that's the right move. And it can be frustrating. I've had people argue with me about it and they shouldn't have. Don't be that person. All right, the next one is on the same page, which is to have a shared understanding or agreement. I think that one's pretty, common and I think is pretty easy to grasp. But are we on the same page? Do we have a shared understanding? And I like the visual of on the same page too, because, if you think about a book and it has information, it also means, are we working with some of the same information? Like, are we thinking the same things? Are we moving along together? Do we have the same information? Keep an eye out for this one too. Like, this is one where if somebody talks about being on the same page, I would be curious what they think the page is. So that's one where it's good to hone your observational awareness, situational awareness, and just, I think that one's a little bit of a yellow flag if somebody talks about being on the same page. All right, the next one is drill down. And so this one, it also has an alternate version, which is to double click. I heard double click a couple years ago. I thought it was super cute. I use it all the time now because I thought it was much more understandable and again, a little bit more visual for corporate people than drill down. But it basically means getting down to that next level of detail, the next level of information. So you might have heard somebody say, oh, we're at the 10,000 foot level. Okay, 10,000 foot level, we just talked about blue sky. So 10,000 foot is up there, kind of near to blue sky thinking. And you need to get grounded in an issue. And so you might be at the 5,000 foot level in the conversation and they're saying, okay, let's drill down. Let's get a little bit more specific. A lot of times drilling down and double clicking takes you from generalities to specifics, which is really nice. And I think that that's helpful because it means that there's an interest in continuing the conversation and to getting more specific so that it's more actionable and solvable. And again, getting it out of the realm of theory or getting it out of the realm of generalizations, right? And so someone might say, hey, we're getting feedback that customers don't like our homepage on our website. And you might be like, oh, let's drill down into that. What other information did the customers provide? Like, when did that start? Did it start when we rolled out this new feature? Oh, they've always hated the website. So it's like getting down to like that next level of information. And if somebody is telling you to drill down, then that means you should then start providing the next level of information. But if somebody's saying that generally in a meeting that you're in, as much as you're comfortable, that's where you might participate in asking questions to do the drilling down. It's usually a series of questions to drill down. All right, we've got a question in chat. Thank you, Jeremy. What if somebody talks about a fire drill? That's such a good one. A fire drill is, I think, great communication at work because somebody is communicating urgency and priority. So if somebody says a fire drill, it's just like a fire drill at work or at home where someone's pulling the fire alarm and you guys run out of the building. So if somebody says, hey, we've got a fire drill, that is a very, very clear signal that you are to drop every single other thing that you're working on and focus on what the fire drill is. And so it's a great signal, like I said, of urgency and priority. The expectation is that you're dropping everything to work on the fire drill. And then the other context in which to use, so it's used immediately to signal people to do what I just described. And it could be anything. Your website's down, there's a data breach, but it's hugely critical. Don't do anything else, help with the thing, right? But the other time it's used is sometimes in hindsight, we might say, hey, there's been too many fire drills. And when we say that, what we're saying is not everything is that urgent, and we can't be in this constant state of chaos, because you should expect a fire drill every once in a while. But if you've got fire drills happening all the time, sometimes the conversation is, why is it that we're having so many fire drills? Is there something broken in our process that things keep breaking all the time and these are legitimate fire drills and we need to somehow fix them and make them less frequent? Or are we too reactive? Are we too, easy to call something a fire drill when it's not? And so I think that, those are the two most common contexts for fire drill, and that's kind of what the expectation is when they're used. So Jeremy, thank you so much for that question. Did that answer your question? Was that good? Okay, I'm hoping yes. My chat is being a little bit weird about how it's popping up. So hopefully, Jeremy, that was good. Okay, awesome. Jeremy just said thank you. Thanks, Jeremy. All right, so that was drilling down in fire drills, which I'm glad Jeremy talked about because they can sound the same and they're totally different. So thank you for asking about that. Leverage is a good one. So leverage means to use something for its maximum advantage, right? So let me think of a few good examples for leverage. It might just mean, hey, we've got some good customer satisfaction right now. Let's leverage that and roll out a poll, which normally people hate polls and surveys. So, or we may have received some information. Let's leverage that information. Let's get the maximum use out of it, and let's do some studies to see what we can do. We've got some data about some customer usage patterns. How can we leverage that data? Meaning, how can we then make that useful? What can we learn from it and then make plans based on that information we have? So there's a lot of different ways people use the word leverage, but leverage just means use, really. I mean, it means utilize. So, but it does mean utilize something in a good way, and kind of like, you know, you found $10 and you want to leverage your $10 is a good way to think about it. But yeah, and to use it to its maximum advantage. All right, raise the bar. I love this one. Raise the bar is to set a higher standard or expectation. And this is often used in two different ways. And so one would be, we need to raise the bar, meaning we're operating it here and we think we're ready to operate up in here, meaning in terms of level of quality, level of efficiency, something usually related to quality or efficiency, but it's always about standards in some way. And so raising the bar might be, raising your customer satisfaction scores in a call center. Like, we need to raise the bar on our customer satisfaction scores. I like this one. The reason I was saying that is because one of the best compliments I've ever received was that I had raised the bar for project delivery at this one client, and it just tickled me pink, right? They're a tough client. It made my day. I've just had that happy glow for years because of that one. And that's the other context in which it's used, is post fact hearing that the bar has been raised in some way, and that's nice. So someone's either indicating we need to raise the bar, or someone's indicating we have raised the bar. But both are things that you really need to pay attention to, because if they're saying we need to raise the bar, then there's an expectation that you are participating in the raising of the standards. So you need to understand what that new target standard is so that you can help raise the bar. And then if someone is saying the bar has been raised, you need to understand in what way so that, again, you can make sure that you're performing at that new expected level. So definitely there's a call to action, which probably should be on this list. There's a call to action there. When you hear someone talking about raising the bar, there's usually something for you to do. And don't ask in the meeting, like, so what do I do? Don't, that's not the, but just be like, oh my gosh, I'd love it. Is that new standard documented somewhere, or are we creating that together? Then you're starting that process of drilling down, see what I did there, into the information about what it's going to take to raise the bar. So that's the best way to approach it. That doesn't make you sound defensive or resisty in some way, because a lot of times people get resisty to change, and you do not want to look like one of those people. All right. After raise the bar, we have in the weeds. Getting lost in too much detail rather than focusing on the big picture. This is so funny. I had a client and he was a strategy leader and he was a very high level strategy leader, like very in the clouds, right? But he was a blue sky thinker. And he would often complain that he was trying to work with these architects and he would say that the architects were out there plucking blades of grass when he was expecting them to be designing the forest or designing the full landscape of the garden, and they would just be sitting there individually picking blades of grass. That's the same thing as being in the weeds, is that you're focusing on the blades of grass when really you need to take the step back and look at, well, what does this whole landscape need to be looking like? And the other way in the weeds is used, it's two ways. It's one, it's someone's telling you you're too focused on the details and you need to lift up a little bit and look more broadly, look across. And a lot of times it also means you're stuck on the wrong details. It's often a signal of that. The kind of third way in the weeds is used is actually meaning you're drowning. And I lately have heard it used more that way, where someone's saying, I am in the weeds. They actually mean they're overwhelmed. And it's still related to this detail thing. It still means they're too in the details, but they're so in the details that they're like drowning in them, like quicksand or like in a marsh or something. So going with the vegetative theme here. But do you see what I'm saying? So in the weeds can mean a few different things. So pay attention to the emotional load with which someone says that they're in the weeds, that someone else is in the weeds, or if they're telling you you're in the weeds. It's a great moment to question, am I in the weeds? And in what way? Like, am I giving the impression that I'm drowning? So if someone tells you it seems like you're in the weeds, oh, get curious about that and just be like, oh, that's so interesting. What are you seeing? Because I haven't recognized that, and I'd love to know what it is that you're observing so that I can better understand what's going on. And thank you for bringing that to my attention, because I actually didn't think I was, but maybe I am. You're showing you're open, but you're being curious and you're trying to get more information so that you can understand, is this just a perception issue, or have you really lost sight of what you should be looking at? It's great signal. Again, I know people hate the buzzwords and stuff. These are very useful because this is how people depersonalize and disambiguate language at work so that you can bring things up without attacking somebody. Because imagine someone saying, hey, you look a little in the weeds, and they mean that you're stressed out. You know, that's much better than them coming to you and saying, wow, you're a hot mess and you're screwing everything up. You know, that means the same thing, right? But it's a much nicer way to say that. And it means you're not being judged. It's non-judgmental. So it's not just nicer like it's fake. It's removing the judgment from it. And it's making through the language indicate this is the thing that happens. We all get in the weeds sometimes. It's okay. But let's help you. Let's recognize it and pull you out. So I like that one. All right. Next is value add. You can see my face. This is another, I think, former consulting one maybe, but the additional benefits provided beyond the basics. So what value adds are there? You know, because this is misused sometimes. You can see on my face that I don't love this one. I don't like how this one's used a lot of times, because people will, your job is to fix a screen, you know, so that it actually collects somebody's email address better. And then they'll be like, what value adds are there? You know, can we make this a better experience? And can we do this? And you're like, literally the ticket was to fix the email address box. The value is give us their email addresses. But really it means what additional things can we do? What additional ways can we add value? And a lot of times this one can also be used post fact, where people are trying to then look back at something that happened and identify value adds that happened along the way. So I tend to be not loving it when people are asking for value adds, because to me it's really expanding scope. Sometimes, right? Not always, but sometimes. Unless it's in a situation where you're doing like product planning and road mapping and you're making sure you're building in enough value adds, I'll accept that. But other times it's scope creep. But when it's post fact, I actually really enjoy it, because I love looking back and saying, what extra things did we do? Like, we were there to deliver this project, we were there to install this software, but we also got our client promoted. We also made them $1 million. You know what I mean? Like, that was on top of what they were expecting to happen. That's a value add. So I like it when it's after the fact and you can look back and say, oh my gosh, look at all these extra amazing things we did. To me, that's fun. Thinking outside the box. So let's think outside the box here. We need to think outside the box. And John is great at thinking outside the box. This one is to be creative and approach things differently. So I don't hear this one as much anymore. I'd be curious. I'd love to hear from you guys if you are hearing this one currently, because I think this one's gone a little bit out of fashion. I think people are more straightforward and they ask for innovation or innovative thinking versus just saying outside the box. But a lot of times, outside the box is specifically used around creative problem solving. So that is when you'll hear it more often than not. Let's think outside the box, meaning let's get creative about solving this problem, or let's get creative about value adds. You can think outside the box about value adds, right? Like, what unexpected business benefits can we give somebody? I had a client who was a major healthcare system, and they were working on thinking outside the box around the patient experience and what value adds can we give to patients in certain contexts. And it really surfaced some interesting things. So I don't mean to sound negative, like thinking outside the box is always bad. I just think it's overused, and a lot of times it's asked for inappropriately, meaning it's asked for in situations where innovation isn't a priority. So I think it's context specific about whether it's appropriate. But either way, if somebody's saying think outside the box, that's what they mean, is to be creative and look at things differently and come up with creative solutions to something and think of something we've never done before. Circle of competence. I don't hear this one a lot. Circle of competence is operating within the areas where someone has knowledge or expertise. So you might say, oh, you wanted to talk about patient experience at hospitals. That is outside Gabby's circle of competence, right? That's not something within Gabby's wheelhouse. That's the other thing you might say, is wheelhouse. Yes, wheelhouse. I don't think that one's even on here. Circle of competence and wheelhouse are the same thing. And I hear wheelhouse a lot more often. So I was looking at the list to see that that's, wheelhouse is not in fact on there. But yeah, circle of competence or wheelhouse, meaning somebody has skills or experience in that area. And usually you're trying to nicely indicate that that is not the best person to go to for that thing, or you're asking if they are the best person. Oh, is that within John's wheelhouse? I really wouldn't say circle of competence, because that's a little too close to the truth. It's a little too on the nose. All right, get buy-in. So getting buy-in means gaining support or agreement from stakeholders. And stakeholders, consider that loosely in this one and not literally. So in the project world, stakeholders mean something specific. And in this list, stakeholders just means an interested party or an affected party. Think of it that way. So you want to get buy-in from people who will be impacted by the thing, from people who are decision makers on the thing. Sometimes you even get buy-in from people who think they're decision makers and aren't. So getting buy-in means you're gaining support or agreement. And you'll often hear, let's socialize that. And I've probably said that a million times, even in my videos. Let's socialize that. Well, you are socializing to get buy-in, meaning you're running your ideas by people, getting their input. But really, you don't want their input, you want their agreement, you want their buy-in. And so we call that socializing. I still think that's a little bit different than running it up the flagpole, because I think that that usually means like getting more leadership support, or even just being earlier in the process of like testing an idea. Usually when you're getting buy-in, you're literally like selling that idea to people in a way that you're already doing the thing and you just hope that they like it. Or you're pretty close to starting to implement the idea and you need buy-in. So that's a little further along in the process. All right, run interference. Run interference means to handle issues or prevent problems on behalf of somebody else. I don't hear this one super often, but it does still happen quite a bit. So in my case, I'll see it happen a lot where I'll ask a client to, and again, I'll say it differently. We use socialize very broadly. So I'll ask my client, can you go socialize this decision we're making with these stakeholders on these two other internal teams at the client? And really, that is running interference in a way. But socializing sounds more positive and less negative. I think running interference sounds a little negative, and so we don't use that anymore. Maybe there's still companies that do, but my company that I have been at and my clients, like, we just don't say that because there's a little bit of negativity associated with it, but it means the same thing. So I would say run interference, handle issues or prevent problems. We do say socialize to mean that as well. We don't always mean getting buy-in on an idea when we say socialize. Sorry, I foolishly Set my iPad on top of my paper. All right, so, but yeah, go handle it. I might say go handle it if it's that versus socializing. So it's an interesting one. All right, the next one is paradigm shift, which is a significant change in thinking or approach. We used to say paradigm shift a lot, and I think it's underused now. And so my pause just then was me thinking, man, I wish we used it more. Because when you're trying to drive a lot of change in an organization, like getting people to work differently, that is what you're doing, is you're introducing a paradigm shift because you're asking them to think differently, you're asking them to work differently. An example might be asking people to be more open to automation. So when you're looking to bring in automation into a certain area, that is a huge paradigm shift. And there were times where we would be bringing in systems to automate certain activities, and the people who were currently doing the job were very resistant. They literally kept saying that's not possible. Like they couldn't even talk about, because they would be the new users of the system, and they couldn't conceptualize it because it was such a paradigm shift for them. And so I really think this is a helpful term to understand, and to then understand it well enough to use as you're progressing in your career and you're getting into more and more of these situations where you might be a change driver, which we'll talk about in a second. You may be somebody who's introducing or is part of a paradigm shift. But it's also really important to recognize when you are the one being shifted, right? When you're being asked to undergo a significant change and do things that's just in a way that's different. And I think that the biggest example for that for people who are entering their careers is it's a paradigm shift to go from being in an educational context to a corporate context and a full-time working context. It's a paradigm shift because the people around you support you differently and the expectations on you are different. So when I say the people around you support you differently, what I mean is your expectations of everybody else are different than the expectations you had of teachers and administrators in school. Like, your boss isn't your teacher, and that may sound obvious, but you're still expecting some of the same behaviors sometimes, and the behaviors they expect from you are different. So that's a huge paradigm shift, right? Which is going into the corporate world, or switching industries is a huge paradigm shift. I mentioned in our previous live that I had worked in academia and then I shifted in the corporate world, and it was a huge paradigm shift for me. It was a lot of culture shock, but everything about how they worked was different. So just keep your eyes open and recognize these paradigm shifts for yourself, because then you can realign your own expectations of, like, I need to think a little bit differently. I need to be open to some new ways of working. And by open, not just be open-minded, don't be stubborn. I literally mean, like, look for it. Look for the ways in which, oh, this is different than what I'm used to, and I need to adjust to that. And because people aren't going to tell you, like, sometimes they will, but that's not their job, because, like I said, they're not your teachers. It's your job to figure it out. So be looking out for that. Or if somebody's telling you there's about to be a paradigm shift, I would get real curious about what's going on. So keep that in mind, because you will at various stages be on either side of a paradigm shift. And you can see I'm getting excited because usually they're fun changes, but they're only fun changes if you go along with them. If you don't, they're not fun, right? All right, the next one is hard stop, a firm time when something might end. And more often than not, you'll see leaders, executives, or SMEs, who are the most required people in some meetings, being like, I've got a hard stop at 3, or the meeting's scheduled from 2 to 3, and they'll say, I've got a hard stop at 2:45. And I love that they're communicating that, and it's very important to respect that. And so when someone is saying they have a hard stop at a certain time, and I see people continuing to ask them questions or keep them on the phone after that time, I will not allow that. And I will be like, okay, remember, John needs to go. John, good luck. Your child's doctor's appointment that you have a hard stop for. We can't keep him any longer. And a lot of times people aren't telling you what the hard stop is, but don't ask if they don't volunteer it. But no, it could be something like that. It could be a pretty serious appointment that they're just not disclosing to you. You need to take it seriously when someone says they have a hard stop. And then, should you ever use hard stop, I'm going to go back to, if you are a required attendee of the meeting. What we don't like to see, and can be a little awkward or embarrassing, is that when we've got, non-essential folks on a call and they start announcing I've got a hard stop and I need to leave, and they're like interrupting the meeting and they don't even have a speaking role, so it doesn't matter if they silently disappear. So just know what your role is in a meeting. That's gonna, you know what, that's a whole topic in and of itself. But in this case, should you say hard stop? Not if you're not a speaker, if you're not required in the meeting. Like if you can just watch the meeting recording later, then you don't need to tell anybody you have a hard stop. But if you are expected to speak, yes, you do need to say that. All right. And if I have a hard stop and someone keeps talking to me, I just want you to know, I just hang up. I say, okay, bye, and I hang up. All right. Drink the Kool-Aid. To fully buy into a company's culture or idea, sometimes without question. So I do say this often. I think I literally said this yesterday. So you talk about, oh, drinking the Kool-Aid. It means you're buying into it. You're believing it. I was at a company where they were so big on their culture. They were all about their culture. And so we would talk about whether or not people were drinking the Kool-Aid about the culture. Were they buying into the culture? Were they supporting the culture? Were they part of it? And it's really funny because unfortunately, this is not funny, but this is a really morbid reference, right? So I don't know where it comes from. Feel free to Google that because I don't know that I want to get into it. But it's not good. Like the origins of that phrase is really not good. We should not say that anymore, but we still say it all the time, you know? Not good. All right, but let's put a pin in that, which leads me to my next one, which is to put a pin in it. To pause or set aside an idea for future discussion. And you might say, gosh, Gabby, that sounds a lot like tabling something. It is a lot like tabling something. Usually, if you're putting a pin in it, you do come back. Remember how I talked about with tabling and parking lotting? You'll probably never hear about that thing again. If you put a pin in it, you will usually come back to that later, sometimes in the same meeting. Sometimes you're putting a pin in it and you're getting to that, you know, in the third section of the presentation, you know? So again, I'm saying don't just understand these phrases, but know when to use them. And so if you're giving a presentation and someone's asking questions that are way ahead of where you are, you know, you can say, oh yeah, I'm getting to that in section 3. Or, you know, and again, a more firm way to say that is, hey, let's put a pin in that because I think we're going to get back to that later in the meeting. But a lot of times if you're newer, your project manager or somebody will handle that for you so that you don't have to be the bad guy. A lot of times the meeting facilitator is the one saying, let's put a pin in that. But you can give them signals by saying that's later in the presentation. All right, putting a pin in things, very valuable because as we all know, I like to keep things moving. All right, so the next one is best practice. A best practice is the most efficient and effective way to accomplish a task. I would say it's not just accomplishing the task, it is sometimes the standard of what it is as well. And sometimes a best practice can be more or less serious. So when you are dealing with data, for example, we talked about how, you know, sometimes fire drills are about data breaches, right? Data is so serious and data confidentiality is so serious. So when we talk about best practices for data, those best practices often support, sorry, my cat just ran off. Those best practices often support legally required actions. And so take best practices pretty seriously sometimes. In other contexts, best practices can be much looser, but a best practice is often derived from, we've identified this is the best way to keep our data secure, to keep our medical instruments sterile. These are the things we do to support that standard or that requirement. And in other contexts, if you're not working for a regulated or with a regulated company, sometimes the best practices are a little more chill, but I would still take them seriously. And a great thing to ask if you're in a new space is, what are the best practices for this? And people go, oh, such a great question, you know, and they'll share that with you. And it's good to know. It's good for you to know what the best practices are. So I think, Morgan, sorry, my cat is yelling at her stuffed mouse. It's pretty cute, but also noisy. But definitely ask a lot about best practices, and you know, that'll be good because you need to learn them, and it shows that you care, and it shows that you're interested, and it shows that your head's in the right place. And if people ever mention best practices to you, do not blow them off. Do not do that. I see people do that when we talk about best practices sometimes, and they'll like even roll their eyes, and I'm like, oh, that's not gonna end well for you. Significant look. Okay, the next one is change agent, which I did say we'd get back to. So a change agent is someone who helps facilitate or drive change within an organization. And that can be a formalized role, but not a job. Or it can be less formal, like someone might say, oh, so-and-so is really a change agent. This came up so much when we were shifting in the development world into Agile, people would be like, they're a change agent for Agile, or they're an Agile evangelist, and so they're a change agent. That came up a lot. And when you're doing project work or when you're driving huge organizational changes, sometimes you formalize who your change agents are, and sometimes you actually designate change champions. And so I'd say change champion is a related term to be aware of. And that is usually like tapping somebody on the shoulder and say, will you champion this change? And it's a great way to build support within the organization. And so that's one of the things we do to get buy-in, to be honest, is we'll identify in different groups some. We don't often identify friendlies. Sometimes we're identifying unfriendlies and asking them to be the change agent, because then we're trying to get their buy-in. And so we're asking them to champion the change, and then psychologically they look for reasons to support it, and then they support it, and then they've gone from a detractor to a supporter. Very powerful. So just pay attention whenever everybody's talking about change agents and change champions. And if you don't know what the change is that they're talking about, again, that's an opportunity. Morgan, no. That's an opportunity to get curious about it, about what the change is and whether you should be a change agent. I would not sign up for that. It's usually a lot of work. It's kind of annoying, but beware. Okay, so that is our first list. So this is the first part. The second part is a list of leader phrases. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to take a drink of water, and I'm going to give you all an opportunity to ask any questions in chat about anything I mentioned, or for you to bring up any of these like lingo, buzzword, jargon phrases that you've heard that I haven't covered. So I'm going to take a drink of water. And again, this is a great time to pop some questions in the chat. All right, so we're going to move on to some key leader phrases. And there's one I'm going to start with. Wow, these are a lot. There's one I'm going to start with that isn't on the list, because I don't know if this one was specific to certain companies or industries, but I started hearing it a lot 10-ish years ago. Oh, okay. What do people mean when they ask about velocity? Usually they're talking about how quickly you're driving towards execution. In the agile world, velocity means something really specific, which is how many points, well, capacity is how many points you can do. Velocity is how quickly you're getting things done. And in the agile world, you're measuring that with story points, about how fast you're moving. But people do often use the word velocity to mean speed to execution in not just agile contexts as well. So they can use different metrics or ways of measuring what the velocity is for something. And usually, if it is specific to Agile, that's something that your Scrum Master and your product manager are working on together. The Scrum Master usually tracks it and reports on it, but a lot of times with these blended roles these days, sometimes it's the product manager who's tracking the velocity of the team. And often it's how well they're doing within this sprint, like how much they're moving in the sprint. So that velocity is always about speed, though, just to be honest, and there's just different ways of measuring it and talking about it. Does that help? I'm going to assume yes. Jeremy's like, that was amazing. Thank you, Kemi. Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. All right. Thanks, Jeremy. Really appreciate the great questions. Those are really good questions. Thank you. All right. So when it comes to something leaders say, like I said, this next thing started coming up about 10 years ago. And it was talking about supporting people, like how much support do they need, or do we need to give them extra support, or actually approaching somebody and saying, I feel like what ways can we support you, or do you need more support in this situation? The reason I'm bringing this one up is because that is a red flag. If you have any sort of leader or manager who's approaching you and asking you about what support you need, that means something is wrong. And they're signaling to you that you're not doing well, and they want you to problem solve why you're not doing well and to tell them what you need. So, yikes. It doesn't mean you're about to get fired, like it's not like that, but it does mean pay attention to it. So again, if you have a leader that's approaching you and is saying, I feel like you might need some additional support, or what support do you need with that situation? They want certain things from you. They want you to be self-aware about the fact that you're struggling, and they want you to be self-aware about what you need in order to accomplish that. And some great answers to that might be, you know what, I was tasked on this and I thought I could learn this new technology faster, but I actually think I either need an architect who knows this technology more than I do, or I need a little bit of time to take a training class. So think about what I just said, which is that they're indicating that they've noticed you're in trouble. They want to help you. Like, this isn't punitive. They want to help you, but it is a sign that you're struggling, and you should know if you're struggling. And if they're asking that and you have no idea what they're talking about, this is again an opportunity to get curious and just be like, okay, I feel like I'm getting the support that I need, but what are you seeing? You know, I might have a blind spot here. I love that because that's showing curiosity and vulnerability, and we all have blind spots, right? And there's been times where I have had some senior leaders come to me and ask me about support, and I've blown them off, and I should not have, right? So I'm speaking from experience on this one. And it's just a good thing to watch out for if somebody ever says that. And you might hear this in different contexts, like, does so and so need some support? Sometimes they're literally asking, do they have the circle of competence to do the job? Do they have the right skills for the job? And this is a great one. If you ever hear anybody talking about this, excuse me, about you or somebody else, get real curious. Like, pay attention and understand what it is that needs to happen. If you're in a conversation that's not about you and you hear it, just listen, you know. But if anybody comes to you asking what support you need, that is a signal that they think you're struggling with something. Find out what it is. And, you know, really be honest with yourself about if they're right. And then think about ways that you can get some help. Because I've heard so many, you know, early career folks, like 5 to 10 year developers, just trying to grit their teeth and get through something that they're struggling with. And they might be hiding that there's an issue with the technology, or they might be hiding that they're in the weeds, and we'll offer them additional developers and they'll say, no, that's more trouble than it's worth. And then it's a death march, you know, for them to the end of the project, and they've refused help. And that says a lot about their decision making ability, right? So these are opportunities to get some help, and they're opportunities to demonstrate that you've got the maturity to know what kind of help you need. So again, watch out for that one. All right, but this list starts a little easier and then gets harder. So what's on the list first is, let's put some skin in the game, asking somebody to be personally invested or take on some risk or responsibility. This is really funny because this goes back to pigs and chickens in the project world. And so when we would talk about stakeholders, we'd be like, are they a pig or a chicken? Because the pig has skin in the game, right? If you're making breakfast. So if you're having ham and eggs for breakfast, the pig has skin in the game and the chicken doesn't. And this is an example of this that is said a little bit more nicely, but it's the same thing, right? Do you have skin in the game? Are you personally invested in this? Are you impacted by the outcome? So you can see by my intense face here that this is a serious statement. If someone's saying, let's put some skin in the game. Now, this could be, you know, I've also heard it at foofy leadership levels where they literally mean, let's just throw some money at it, or let's invest some money in something and we've got skin in the game. It doesn't always mean something like, you know, morbid, you know, but it is, you know, you're investing in some way, financially or responsibility wise, but again, something to pay attention to. Take ownership. And you guys might be hearing this one a lot, right? So if someone is saying take ownership, they're being encouraged to take responsibility for a project or an outcome. And sometimes it's just taking, you know, ownership of a task. But I think people don't know what taking ownership looks like. Like, I think a lot of people hear take ownership and they're aware that there's a sense of responsibility that's being conveyed or asked for. But I think that, you know, what some people struggle with is, what does that actually look like in practice? Because I genuinely think it's not one standard, right? And I think that's why it can be confusing, because when I say take ownership, it may be a different level of responsibility than when someone else says it. Or I might be expecting certain behaviors that someone else isn't expecting. So if I'm saying take ownership to a leader, my expectation is that leader has the business acumen and situational awareness to determine what level of ownership is appropriate and what behaviors go along with that, right? If I'm saying this to a more junior employee, though, I don't expect them to have the ability to do that, because they don't have the experience and the business acumen to be able to determine what ownership looks like. So usually if it's me, I'm usually asking for the behaviors that I specifically want to see, which is completing activities on time, caring about the quality of the work, proofreading the quality of the work before it's delivered to me, being proactive and communicating with me about things. I mean specific things when I say take ownership. But I will tell the person the things I'm expecting. If they don't do those things, then I might say, I would expect to see a high level of ownership from you because this was your assigned task. So keep in mind that people do sometimes mean different things by take ownership, but it usually means complete it, be accountable for it, communicate about it in some way, definitely do it on time, but people care about different things about that more or less, right? So this goes back to knowing the expectation and understanding them. And if you're newer, I always say take advantage of being new to an organization, to that manager, because you can ask, okay, normally when I take ownership, I do these things. What does that look like for you, though? You'll hear me say that all the time. What does that look like for you? Because you're subtly implying, yes, there are some subjective expectations here, and I need you to communicate them. But what does that look like for you is such a nicer way to say that, right? And I know that we all kind of roll our eyes at the corporate speak, but when you're in the trenches and it gets tense and aggressive, saying things the nice way is nice. And you won't like it when people say things to you the not nice way. And so this lingo exists for a reason. It's useful, it's helpful, and it really depersonalizes things. I'm just gonna say it again. Some things are subjective, but doesn't mean it's personal. All right. We need to be agile, emphasizing the importance of adaptability and quick responses to changes. So yeah, agile, whatever anybody says we need to be agile, they always mean adaptable and they always mean speed. And that may not be technically what some of those words mean, but that is the intention behind saying we need to be agile. It means we need to adapt and we need to do it quickly. So, okay, lead with empathy. And again, you will often hear these things from leaders. So, lead with empathy means managing and interacting with others by prioritizing understanding their feelings and needs. And so, where might you hear this? You might hear a leader say that they lead with empathy. And so, they're trying to convey to you that they care about people's feelings and consider them. You may hear a leader giving this direction. And if they're giving this direction to you, that means you are a team lead, a project leader, supervisor, or manager, or director being coached to be more empathetic. And if you're being coached to lead with empathy, that means it's probably not organic to you to behave that way. And I find that very relatable. I'm a results oriented person, personally, professionally. And so my empathy while there isn't my first go to when it comes to results and accountability. And so I'm leading from a results driven perspective, or I'm leading from the front. And being asked to lead with empathy means recognizing that means that it's not your natural behavior, and then knowing how to then appropriately incorporate other people's feelings and reactions and weigh those in. So if you're being coached on that, I would suggest getting a course or a book on empathy specifically. But 9 times out of 10, for most of you, I think you'll just be hearing a leader describe themselves that way, and that's what that means. But I would also, just as part of your learning journey, then pay attention to, is it true? Because a lot of times when leaders describe themselves this way, it's not true. It means they've been coached on it and now they tell people they do it, but they don't do it, because if they do it, they don't need to say that they do it. Does that make sense? So I would say watch them, see if they actually do it, and if they do, awesome, and then learn from that. But if they don't, also learn from that. Okay, the next one is table stakes, referring to the minimum requirements or expectations to compete or participate. So where do I hear this one at work? Because we do say it all the time. I'll say, we were working with a branding freelancer, and we were going back and forth about what they were going to be delivering, and they were not communicating deadlines or meeting deadlines. And to me, that's table stakes. Being able to communicate your deadline and being able to meet your deadline is table stakes for working with me. Does that make sense? And table stakes is a gambling term. It means buying in to be able to sit at the table. And so, in the gambling world, you're anteing up 5K or something. I don't know, that's table stakes. But again, in the business world, is what's the minimum cost of entry to participate, or what is the minimum set of behaviors that you expect to see in order to be involved in something. So we could be evaluating vendors, and we could say that them having this particular SOC compliance thing is table stakes to being considered for being a vendor, if that makes sense. Probably not, because that was a really specific example. But you might be, evaluating a doctor, and them having an office is table stakes for them being on your doctor list, or maybe not. Maybe you want a virtual doctor, and that's table stakes for you. So I'm trying to use some personal examples because those might be a little bit more accessible than all the work ones, but that's what it means if you hear it. But if you're hearing it, if I were you, I'd be curious about what your company considers to be table stakes for that thing. These are all learning opportunities. These are all signals to get curious about what's underneath it. You know what the phrase means, but what do they consider to be table stakes? Like, learn that. That's awesome. All right, empower the team. Giving the team the authority or tools they need to do their job effectively. Empowering the team. Empowering the team can also mean some of the soft things, like delegating the authority. Like, you're empowered to make that decision. You're empowered to determine that. And I love calling out when someone's empowered to do something, because a lot of times people are struggling because they're expecting to be told something, or somebody else is, telling them how to do it, telling them what to do, or making a decision for them. And so I love using this language and making it clear, no, you're empowered to go find options for that. You're empowered to go look at different sets of software that you think might solve this problem. You're empowered to solve this problem yourself, actually. And you're empowered to determine when you can go to the doctor. You don't need to ask me, So knowing what your authority level is important. And the nice way to talk about it is about empowerment. And a lot of times leaders will, if they see that you're struggling with being empowered, they will share that with you. And I think that's awesome. And sometimes it is specifically, tools or specific guidance that they're getting empowered on. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Avoiding creating something from scratch if a similar solution already exists. I'm cracking up about this one because it's so important to know what you have available, and it drives me crazy. As my former company that I worked at for a very long time got bigger and bigger and bigger, our internal tools grew and grew and grew. So people had a hard time keeping track of what solutions we already had. And then we started hiring a bunch of new people who didn't know what solutions we already had. And so they started trying to create solutions to problems that no longer existed because we already had those solutions. They were reinventing the wheel. And so this is a really nice way to tell a lot of information to somebody in a very short phrase. Hey, let's not reinvent the wheel here. Meaning, yes, we already have this solution. Yes, you're completely ignorant of the solution. Yes, we hired you and you should already be educating yourself about what we have. So this one's a funny one to me because, it can get really frustrating. And that's hard because you're hiring a lot of people that you want to be problem solvers and innovative and use their ingenuity, and they're used to being leaders, and they're used to being change drivers as well. And they get into a company and they actually don't care to learn what solutions are already there. But unfortunately, reinventing the wheel involves a lot of wasted time and money. And so that's why it's really important to know, do we already have a wheel, right? And so if you're making a suggestion in a meeting and someone says to you, well, let's not reinvent the wheel here, I wouldn't make a thing of it in the meeting. Just be like, oh yeah, totally. And then later I would ask a trusted mentor, peer, or even your manager, and just be like, hey, they said they don't want to reinvent the wheel, but I'm not aware of the solution that already exists. Can you put me in the right direction? Again, I'm always going to say educate yourself. All right. Manage up. Communicating effectively with your manager or providing them with information to make their job easier. Managing up is one of the best skills you can have at work. And so let's talk about managing. So in this context, I think it's important to know that you manage down, you manage across, and you manage up. And you may be in a situation at whatever role or level you're at where you don't have a down to manage, And managing across is just working within your team, like based on your scope of responsibilities. So your first and only direction you're going is to manage up. And one of the best things to do to manage up is to keep your boss informed. Don't overuse their political clout. Problem solve on your own and only go to them with when necessary. But again, you're keeping them informed so they're not surprised by things, right? So managing up can also mean making your boss's job easier, again, by keeping them informed so they're not surprised, by not demanding too much of their time. And then other ways you start managing up is you start doing useful things for your boss. You start producing reports that they haven't had access to before. You start providing them with information in other ways that they weren't getting. And like, let's say you're in a situation where you have a broader view of something than they do, you can give them those insights. That's very, very helpful, and that is a way of managing up. But one of the first and best ways that you manage up, like I said, is keeping your manager informed and setting expectations with them. Meaning, if they ask you to do 5 things, you setting their expectation is, okay, these 5 things are going to take me 4 weeks and I'm going to do them in this order. That is also managing up. And the better you manage up, the better you look within your organization. And I see tons of people who eventually, in their promotion cycles, sometimes are terrible at managing across, and they can still get promoted pretty far because they're amazing at managing up. And other people can manage up and across, and they're not so great at down. And one of the interesting things to keep an eye on, depending on where you are in your career and where you want to go in your career, is that as you progress through these levels, you realize, oh my gosh, I used to be really good at managing up and now I'm not, because the up from you is now at a different level and the way you manage up changes. And the same thing with managing across. You may have had great experiences in your peer group when you were, at an individual contributor level, a lead level, a manager level. You get into director role, a lot of times directors don't get along, and so your ability to manage across, you need to regrow that, right? So it's like lifting a heavier set of weights. I'm going to put it that way. So think about that. If someone is saying you need to manage up better, then revisit what I just said about the ways to manage up. Because again, that is the first and most important way that you do need to be managing, is managing your boss. And if you want me to do a whole episode on that, I can, because you can tell there's a lot here and it's very important. It's one of the most important things on this list, to be honest. Boil it down. Boiling it down means simplifying a complex situation or idea into its essential points. And this is something that you need to have the ability to do this for yourself, and then you need to grow the ability to do this for and with other people. And boil it down just means distilling things. And so I'll have people come to me and they'll tell me some 45-minute story. And I'm listening, and I'm like, okay, so the situation is your boss is trying to get promoted, your revenue is too low, and he's asked you to go sell 2 new clients. And they're like, yes, right? That is boiling down a 45-minute story into the 3 essential points: the context, the background, and the ask. And so this is an effective communication mechanism, and I would say it's an essential skill, and the better you are at it, the more highly you're seen, because boiling something down quickly and accurately requires a pretty significant amount of critical thinking. And if you're good at that, that's a great thing to show off in a very non-show-offy way, and people will recognize that. People will want that. So it's a very attractive quality, and it's a very attractive skill. And I also think it's important to know, and I learned by observation, some of the cultural norms of your company and your coworkers and your team. I think it's so important to see how they do it and learn from the people around you. So if this is a new concept for you, or if I explained what it is and you're like, oh, I hadn't heard the term, but yeah, I get it. Great. But I would say pay attention when somebody's talking about boiling it down. Like if you're an observer in the meeting, or just not a key participant, look at how they do it and learn from that, because it's very important. And this is something project managers have to do when they summarize meetings, right? So like the meeting recap at the end, that's boiling down the meeting. It's the same thing. Okay. The next one is move at the speed of trust. This is another thing leaders say. And it means progress at a pace that matches the level of trust within the team or organization. Oh, man. Okay. Wow. That's actually really important. So let's say that a manager is asking a team and that team is new to them, and that manager is asking them to change 5 fundamental things about how they do their jobs. So the manager and the team are new to each other. The team has been working a certain way for a long time, and that manager comes in and is like, "I'm gonna change everything about how you do everything." Well, think about that. That's not gonna work because that team does not trust that manager yet. They don't know them, and so there's a little bit of inherent trust that they're a leader and that they've been placed over them, but that's a huge amount of trust to expect that a team is going to change that many things, that many behaviors, that many processes. And they have exceeded the speed of trust in that situation. And it's kind of like, I'm going to use a dating example, right? It's kind of like if you've gone on 2 dates and someone asks to move in together. The relationship's not there, the trust isn't there, you know, or let's do a shared bank account, right? That's a good one, right? Second or third date, let's open a shared bank account. No. You should not trust the other person that much. That's, the speed of trust there. You're exceeding it, right? Moving at the speed of trust is, on the third date, maybe you have dinner at your house, right? Like you can trust them that much, not bank account much. So think about that at work. And this is one where I'm not expecting you to do anything with this one other than just if a leader is using this phrase, just understanding and knowing what it means. And as you move into leadership roles, I would bring this back up. The reason I'm making this face is I'm like, wow, I have definitely made some mistakes on this one in my past. So I'm laughing at myself on this one. All right, peeling back the onion. Explore a situation or problem layer by layer to get to the core issue. Oh, I like this one. So yes, this would involve drilling down and double clicking on an issue. But yeah, peeling back the layers can mean getting more and more specific, and it can also mean getting rid of essential or extraneous information or perspectives in order to get to the core of something. And so as you progress in your career, you will get better at doing this. And if you're working with somebody who has super high discernment, they may already know the core, but by peeling back the layers, they're bringing the team along with them in this process, because it's really important that people are part of the process and that you don't just give them the answer. So you may be sitting there and you may have gone through this a couple times, some of these peeling back the onion processes or situations, and you might be like, yeah, the answer was obvious. It isn't obvious to everybody. Not everybody has that quick discernment. And when they don't, or let's say they've arrived at a different answer, honestly, but the act of going through this exercise together gets everybody on the same page, it gains buy-in, and it just really makes people feel more ownership of the answer because they've been part of solutioning it by peeling back the layers of the onion. And I use a lot of buzzwords there, but you know what they all mean now. So, all right. Let's stay in our lane. Let's stay in our lane. Stick to areas of responsibility without overstepping boundaries. That's a big one. And that might be you're in a meeting full of different technical SMEs, and the DBA is trying to give the web developer UX advice, right? Like the actual user experience advice to the web developer. He's so far out of his lane. He's like on a different road. He's so far out of his lane on that one. His job is the data, right? Not the presentation layer, and not, the customer's experience of it. So stay in your lane, bro. And I often am very frustrated at people not staying in their lane. And you want people to be passionate and excited, and etc. But it is kind of a red flag when you're in meetings with SMEs, and the SMEs seem to always be talking about somebody else's business, and they never seem to be SMEing in their own area of expertise. That's always a red flag, right? And it can be really frustrating when people violate boundaries. And I'll have this in leadership meetings where other leaders would try and give me advice about my own team or my practice. And I'd be like, stay in your lane, bro. That's not your problem. I did not ask for your advice. So yeah, let's stay in our lane is important. And saying it stay in your lane aggressively to a person is the wrong way to do it. Again, saying it like this is in, hey, let's all stay in our lane. That's the nice way to do it without calling out anybody individually. All right, and then let's do bring it to the next level, improve or enhance something beyond its current state. So this is a great way to talk about raising the bar on something and improving that baseline. So your web page might load in 5 seconds, and somebody might say, let's bring it to the next level, which means the web page loads in 3 seconds. It's a boring example, but it's a good example. Okay, bring it to the next level. Let's do a sanity check. Quickly review an idea to see if it makes sense or is reasonable. I love sanity checking things. It's a great way to get buy-in, to be honest, because anybody who then says, yeah, no, that passes my sanity check, well, now suddenly they're bought in. They've advocated for your idea, even informally. But also, I do love sanity checks because sometimes I'm like, am I crazy? Like, I might be like, hey, everybody's making this problem sounds so serious, but I feel like it's like this. Can you sanity check me? Am I the crazy one, or is everybody else actually making this overcomplicated? So a good sanity check is super helpful. All right, the next one is fail fast, learn faster. Okay. Fail fast is another agile principle, which means you move quickly. You don't wait till something's perfect. You don't overanalyze it. Like, get something out the door and let it fail or let it work, and then you're learning from it, right? So fail fast, learn faster is encouragement to take risks, accept failures, and move on quickly with lessons learned. And if people are saying that, that's great. That means it's a safe space to have failures, but they want you to do it quickly. And they want you to be able to move on from it quickly as well. So yeah, I actually really enjoy that. And it's more common in either small groups within a large company or within small companies. Unfortunately, when companies get too big and they don't silo correctly, they just get too slow, and you can't do this, and there is huge repercussions for failure. So just know if this is the culture or not. If you're hearing a leader say it, make sure that they mean it, because sometimes they don't always mean it. But this is another example of good is better than perfect, and I think that that's such an important thing to learn. And I think that failing fast and learning faster is get it out the door and learn from it. It's the same thing as good is better than perfect. Done is better than perfect. I said that wrong like twice. That's embarrassing. But I learned fast. Okay, so run point on this. That means someone is taking the lead on a task or project. And that could be like, hey, we need to find out if the data center can do yada yada. Okay, can you run point on that? Meaning, can you go chase that down and then report back? Like, you can be in charge of finding out about this. Pushing back, question or challenge an idea or directive instead of simply agreeing. So a leader might say, I don't really want to see a lot of pushback on this. That's clear, right? Like, go along with it. Or we've received more pushback on this than I expected. They might be curious why. Some leaders are like me, where they make statements more than they ask questions. So I might say, hey, I received a lot more pushback on that than I expected, ... And I'm expecting somebody to fill in the blank and tell me why. But yeah, there's more challenge to something, and sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not good. Sharpen the focus. Narrow down efforts to concentrate on the most critical areas. So that's clear, right? Like, we need to be focused on this specific thing. Okay, and then show thought leadership means establishing oneself as an expert by providing innovative insights or ideas. This I really like, because as we talk about establishing your brand and creating your reputation, this is one of the things that we talk about is thought leadership. And where can you demonstrate thought leadership? And an example of this might be, I love budgeting and financials. And so I became a thought leader within the group about how we run our reports and how we track things so that we could be constantly reforecasting and readjusting. And I would be an advocate for having actual forecasts ahead of time so that we could do that reforecasting. So I was a thought leader in the space of operational financials, right? And another thing that you could be a thought leader on is in a process. You could be a thought leader about how to do process improvement, or you could be a thought leader about a process that your company uses or a way of doing something. Or you could be a thought leader on telling sales stories, like how you tell the story of a sale to other clients to get more sales. There's lots of ways to be a thought leader on something. So when we say SME, it doesn't always mean technical, right? It doesn't always mean you have to go be a thought leader on data cloud, which is great, love it. But you don't have to be that thought leader. Like, it doesn't mean just because I'm not technical, I'm not a thought leader. You can be a thought leader in a lot of different ways. And an example of that is product managers or thought leaders. They're setting the direction for a product, they're coming up with vision, they're coming up with features and ideas for that. They're thought leaders in that space. And product directors are also thought leaders in terms of like setting a higher level direction for a set of products or cloud tools or just anything else. Lots of ways to be a thought leader and to show thought leadership. Showing thought leadership means putting into action. Like, don't just sit there and have these amazing thoughts. Like, you have to actually tell them to people. I have to say that for those of you introverts and introspective folks and analyticals, it has to come out of the mouth in order to be real. Land the plane means wrap up a discussion or reach a conclusion. Sometimes landing the plane also means finishing a project. Like, we need to land that plane. It's been in the air for like a year. So just finishing something, wrap it up. Keep your finger on the pulse. Stay informed about the latest developments or mood in the team or industry. So keep your finger on the pulse is good. When it comes to a team, it could be you guys have been putting in some changes, like org changes, process changes. Like, hey, keep a pulse on how the team's feeling about that. Or do a pulse check. I like doing pulse checks. It's a little different than a sanity check because it's a little bit more of like, hey, what's your emotional reaction to this? How are you feeling about this? But doing a pulse check on an idea or on the progress of something or how well something's going, very important actually. All right, I'm going to take a quick drink of water, and I know I've gone fast through some of those, so if there's any questions about any of the ones that I just said, please put your questions in chat while I take a drink of water, because like I said, I know I went fast, we've got a few more to go. And really quick, keeping your finger on the pulse is more than just a pulse check. A pulse check is a one-time thing. Keeping your finger on it means continue to pay attention to this. Sorry, I did want to clarify that. So keep your finger on the pulse means you need to track that for usually like 3 months or so. Don't take that as prescriptive. It depends on how long the thing you're doing is, okay? All right. The next one is build a narrative. Create a story or argument to communicate an idea or plan effectively. So I'm so big into storytelling, and sometimes you talk about storytelling and people think there's some artificiality associated with that, but building a narrative is creating a story that's not false. Oh, if someone says they have a bias for action, how could that manifest? Thank you, Jeremy. That is another really good question. A bias for action means that they tend to execute quickly. They tend to jump into action quickly. They may also be communicating that they might skip deep analysis or risk assessment. And they're letting you know that they prefer that in you as well. And so if you're working for a leader that says they have a bias for action, they're not just telling you how they are, they're telling you sometimes what they prefer from you. And they may be sensing that that's not your organic or natural style, is to have a bias towards action. Again, you might be a little bit more analytical. You might like to overthink and overplan. And I say over, and I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I also have a bias for action. And so again, they're not just describing themselves. They're telling you what their preference is for you and what they expect to see from you as well. Jeremy, does that help? Does that answer your question? Or have you seen that used differently? I think Jeremy's agreeing. He's typing out a very lengthy follow-up question. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And just to wrap up the building a narrative, it says a story or argument to create an idea or plan effectively. Sometimes building a narrative can also be post-fact, and sometimes it's telling the story of something in a digestible way. Like, let's build a narrative around that project. And sometimes that means let's spin it. Like, let's make it sound better than it was. Sometimes building a narrative when it's post-fact is adding a little bit of spin. Oh, Jeremy's saying there's a long chat delay. I'm sorry, Jeremy. I did not have the settings options on this live that I did on the other one, and so I wasn't able to control the chat delay, and I think that might be the problem. So thank you for telling me, and I'll look into how to do that differently next time. So thank you for sharing that with me. All right, building a narrative could be me telling a story about this live after the fact, but they're saying here an argument to create an idea or plan effectively. And again, when you are pitching an idea, you do need to build a narrative around that idea. And so I'm actually going to do an entire video on how to effectively pitch ideas, because I think that this isn't enough of a description for it to be actionable. So now you know what it means, but how do you do it is a totally different thing. And that is a much longer conversation. So we're going to table that and circle back to that in another video. All right, and so the next one is connecting the dots, which is showing the relationships between various pieces of information to provide a complete picture. Yes and no. I'd say it is making the picture. Sometimes it means literally connecting the dots means synthesizing the information. It means putting together A plus B plus C and coming up with now I have a house. And so sometimes connecting the dots isn't just like there's this linear progression, but also what does it add up to? What is the conclusion or the outcome? Like you've connected the dots, and sometimes it paints a picture. So, but yes, it's showing the relationships and providing the complete picture. And sometimes that means you need to fill in the dots. And so if someone's talking about connecting the dots, sometimes you might have the picture, but they're asking you to fill in the A plus B equals C part of the equation and drill down into the information in order to connect the dots. I'm sorry, I'm not actually doing that one on purpose. All right, and the next one is own your narrative. Be proactive in defining your story or how others perceive you. I love this because just like we're talking about building your brand at work and building your reputation, this is about owning your narrative. I would say it differently. I call it controlling your narrative. But what you want to make sure is that you have your narrative, you know what your story is, and you are controlling and managing what that is, how people perceive you based on the story you tell about a situation. And sometimes you tell a story about a situation and you then make that propagate through your company, through trusted people, and now that's the fact. Now that you've created this narrative, that narrative becomes fact because it's spread. So building a narrative is really, really powerful. And so if you're hearing a leader say this, be clear on, are they informing you to do that? Or are they mentioning that someone's doing that? Or are they just saying that's a thing? But sometimes when leaders are just saying something's a thing, they're indicating that you should do that thing. All right, the next one is raise your hand, volunteer for a task, or express interest in taking on more responsibility. I think this one's pretty clear. Like, hey, are you gonna raise your hand for that? It doesn't mean literally that, but it does mean signing up for something, basically. Get alignment, ensure everyone involved is in agreement on a decision or course of action. This is more than just being on the same page. This means that everybody literally agrees. Like everybody needs to be in agreement before you can move forward. They need to be in alignment, but it just means in agreement. Set the tone. Establish an example of behavior or attitude that others should follow. So setting the tone is really, really interesting because this can look like a few different things. You could be running a workshop and they're talking about setting the tone for the workshop. Well, what is it? Is it fun? Is it collaborative? Is it introspective in some way? Is it more serious because something bad happened and so the tone needs to be more reflective? So setting the tone can be very specific and context-based based on, like I said, is it a workshop or a meeting or something like that? But setting the tone can also be much bigger picture for that. You could be setting the tone for a team. Someone could be talking about how a leader sets the tone for their organization, which could be an entire business unit or a division. And setting the tone can mean being very business focused or making sure that we are very culture focused. So our tone has a lot to do with living our culture. And so sometimes tone is about messaging, sometimes it's about vibes. I'm just gonna say it. Setting the tone is sometimes about like setting the vibes and like what's the vibes. And sometimes there is also some messaging that goes along with that. And so sometimes people will set the tone in an organization by having an intentional vibe for this upcoming year, but also having certain keywords that the leaders are planting within the organization that is part of that vibe, like fiscal responsibility and operational efficiencies and things like that. So the tone could be about operational excellence because you guys have had some mistakes. So it's really interesting Set the tone, yeah. I don't know how often you'll hear people talk about that, but you'll see people doing it without talking about that. I can tell you that. Holding space for others or hold space for others. Create an environment where others feel heard and supported without judgment. And I think that this is actually something where it's been in the vernacular socially and has moved into the corporate world. So I think that holding space might be something that some people are actually more familiar with because it has been part of the cultural landscape in recent years and has then bled into corporate. This is unusual in that aspect. So I think people might be more familiar with that. But again, it's creating an environment where others feel heard and supported without judgment. It's very important that this has moved into the corporate landscape because the business world just hasn't been known for that, right? Like we talk about we want this to be a safe space, but holding space, like being intentional about creating a safe space, just traditionally not been a part of the business world or corporate life. And instead, everybody has been expected to fit this certain mold and adapt to corporate life. So, holding space for others, I think that I haven't heard it lose its meaning yet. And I'm saying that very carefully because a lot of times something will enter the consciousness of companies and they try and be good and progressive about some things, and then it loses steam or they never actually meant it. They were just saying things because they were supposed to. This one, when people say it, I think they mean it because it is considered to be such a specific cultural meaning, like a sociological and societal meaning, that if I'm hearing somebody say that at work, they honestly really, really mean it. And it's genuine. And it, like I said, it hasn't lost its meaning yet. So if you hear a leader talking about this, that's a very green flag about that leader, in my opinion. Courageous conversation. Okay, I've heard this called hard conversations, courageous conversations, brave conversations, and fierce conversations. These all mean the same thing. And it is a difficult but necessary discussion that may require honesty and vulnerability. Honesty and vulnerability. So that is code for saying hard but true things that you and or the other person might get emotional about. That's what this is code for. And leaders have fierce conversations with each other. Sometimes your courageous conversation might be giving your manager hard feedback. An example of a courageous conversation in that context is telling somebody that they hurt your feelings. And that requires you being vulnerable and being honest about it and saying, hey, in this situation you said this and I'm sure you didn't mean it this way, but it genuinely hurt my feelings. And I know some of that's me, but I just really wanted to share that with you, that this is the kind of thing that hurts my feelings. And it did happen. My feelings were hurt in this situation. That's a courageous conversation. Another one might be you felt not heard in a meeting or you felt like somebody was talking over you and you need to talk to that person. And so that's a courageous conversation to go and say, hey, I was presenting my idea in this meeting and I felt like you really spoke over me or you were dismissive of my idea. It takes courage to say that. That's why in this case it's being called a courageous conversation or a brave conversation. Sometimes fierce conversations are more argumentative than that. This is you being vulnerable and open and honest, and hopefully they're the same in return. Hopefully they're receptive and they give you that space and hold space for you and they're respectful in their response. If you need to have a courageous conversation, my number one tip is just to give your manager a heads up. And if they're the one you have to have the courageous conversation with, it's okay to preface the conversation by saying, this is requiring some courage on my part, and just I'm going to say it the best way I can, but just hear me out and know that this is, a hard thing for me to talk about. And then they're going to be more open and receptive to the fact that you might get emotional. You're being vulnerable, and with vulnerability comes emotion. So when you hear leaders talking about courageous conversations, I always say perk your ears up. Are they instructing you to have one? Are they saying some, a courageous conversation happened? But that's a signal that there's a lot of depth there that they're not getting into, and that there's, other things at play that you don't know about. But if someone is recommending you have a courageous conversation, and an example of that might be that this has come up differently, that you might be in one of the situations I mentioned, but that you've gone to your manager and you said, Sally keeps talking over me in this meeting. Your manager might say, I encourage you to have a courageous conversation with Sally. And now you know what that looks like now that we've talked about it, right? You and I. And if you need some additional support from your manager in that situation, you can say, okay, I'm really signed up for that. Can I rehearse it with you? Can you give me any pointers? Is there anything you know about Sally where I can incorporate that so I can approach her the best way possible? Like, you can ask for more information. It's not like they're just sending you off into the wilderness. But this is a great example of where you are empowered to address interpersonal issues yourself. This goes back to that empowerment that we talked about, knowing that you are empowered to do so. You are also expected to do so. So when we talk about managers don't like people complaining, or if you're hearing, oh, these people or this group or this person needs to solve problems on their own, this is an example of that, where leaders and managers are expecting that you are addressing interpersonal conflict yourself and trying to resolve it yourself versus going to a leader and asking them to fix it for you. You are empowered and expected to do it yourself. All right. The last one on the list, and then I have a bonus one at the end, is move from strategy to execution. And this is take actionable steps to implement a plan after deciding on the strategy. And a lot of times they're just indicating that they're transitioning from strategy into execution, which is starting to actually implement. Other times they're indicating that people are trying to stay in the strategy phase for too long. So my example of this was, I'll tell people like, hey, I think we've talked about this enough. It's time to start working on it. Or let's not overthink this. It's time to jump into it. But a really good way to say it is, hey, we've already worked on the strategy and we have a plan. It's time to start moving on it. And so if you hear someone say that, that's a great self-check of, am I stuck in analysis paralysis? Am I afraid to get started for some reason? Like, have we been in strategy for too long? Or they may just be signaling, like I said, that it's the natural changeover from this phase into this phase. But pay attention to it, and keep that in mind. Okay, I'm gonna take a drink of water right quick. And while I do that, let me know if you guys have any more questions about anything I just talked about, or like I said, if I'm leaving anything off the list, or even if you just hopped in, we're decoding corporate buzzwords and phrases, so pop some into chat if I haven't covered it, or if you haven't heard me say it, and I'd be happy to talk about it. And so I have another list that I'm going to go through in a different live, because this one's been going for a while and it's a separate topic, but it is related, which is kind of ways leaders are failing us. And this is a natural offshoot of what we just talked about with the courageous conversations, because I think sometimes leaders aren't having courageous conversations. And one of those situations, yesterday I talked about how they're not telling you about not getting promoted. That is a courageous conversation that they're dodging. But another one is, a lot of times leaders are not managing bad behavior of their employees, and they over rely on expecting people to work things out amongst themselves and have these courageous conversations at the peer level, when sometimes there is bad behavior that is systemic, and Sally interrupts everybody in that meeting and somebody needs to talk to Sally about it. And you can tell her that's your experience, but if she's doing that to everybody, her manager needs to have that conversation with her if she's getting that feedback consistently. So I'd say that keep an eye on courageous conversations, because I think leaders need to be more consistent about doing it themselves. And I do see a gap where in some organizations you've got really non-confrontational leaders who are encouraging other people to have hard conversations so they don't have to. And so if you think that might be happening, you've talked to Sally and she's not changed her behavior, then go back to your manager and just say, hey, I feel like I've done what I'm supposed to do. I've had this courageous conversation with her and it's still happening. What's the next step? Because then you're gently nudging them that this is actually a management issue that needs to be addressed without saying that, right? Like, there's really nice ways to remind people that they need to be doing something and they need to take ownership of it. And that is a nice way, is to say, hey, so what's the next step on that? Because I feel like I've exhausted my resources, or I've done the thing that I can do and should do, and it's not really appropriate for me to go further. So what is the next step here? All right, everybody, this has been so fun talking through decoding the corporate lingo and also talking specifically about things leaders might say in addition to that and what it is that they mean and what it is that they expect from you when they're saying that. I'd love to know, and so I'm going to take a minute here and just ask everybody, I'd love to know, again, is there anything I haven't covered? Is there anything that is even a little bit related that you want to know about? This is a great time to drop your questions in the chat, tell your stories in chat. Happy to answer any questions. So, and as always, I'm going to take a drink of water and give you guys a minute to talk, especially since Jeremy said that there is a little bit of a chat delay, just so you know. Amy Kate, thank you for saying this has been helpful. I really appreciate that. I love that feedback. And thank you again for your support and joining. I've heard from Amy Kate and Jeremy so far in chat. I'd love to hear from more people as well. And just thank you all for supporting the live. And I hope that this has been helpful for everybody. So thank you for saying that, Amy Kate. And I'm going to take a drink of water. And the replay of this live will be available on the channel. So I'm excited for anybody who's missed part of it. They can go back and watch the earlier pieces, or if people had to come and go, they can look at it. So the replay will be available, and I've enjoyed this. I can't wait to do more of these. Thank you so much for joining. And I think that's going to be it for today. Thank you all so much. And again, I'm Gabby from She Makes It Work, and I'll see you in the next one.